Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And before we start, a big thank you to those supporting the channel with an extra membership, especially the Scouts. I see you, I appreciate you, and I create this for you. Now, let's get started. My name is Mark Delano. I've worked as a federal air marshal for just over 9 years, most of it out of the New York field office. Before that, I served in the Marines, including time in Kabul and Helmand. But the work I do now feels very different. It's quieter, discreet. I fly unannounced on commercial flights, blending in with passengers, carrying a weapon I'm not allowed to display unless the situation absolutely calls for it. Every flight begins the same way. Badge verification at the checkpoint, weapon inspection, proper paperwork filed and signed off at the departure terminal. You don't just stroll onto an international flight with a loaded pistol. There are layers of clearance, protocols that protect both the airframe and the people on board. It started like any other assignment, a direct flight out of London, bound for the States. Full load, familiar aircraft. I'd worked this type so often I could move through it blindfolded. My seat was at the back, aisle side, with just enough line of sight to the forward cabin to do my job. We rolled out of the gate on time and lifted off without issue. The skies over London were clear, the mood inside subdued. Nothing in those early hours gave any hint that we'd never make it to our scheduled destination. The early stages of any flight are usually the easiest. Once the wheels are up and we're at cruising altitude, most threats are behind us. It's the boarding and descent phases that typically carry the highest risk. I watched the usual shuffle. Passengers adjusting tray tables, peeling plastic off in-flight meals, parents trying to quiet restless toddlers. Across from me was a young guy in a college hoodie binge-watching something on his phone. Behind me, an elderly couple was doing crossword puzzles together. Everyone was just trying to pass the hours until we touched down in New York. About 4 hours into the flight, just past the southern tip of Greenland, the first signs of trouble appeared. It wasn't loud, not at first. A man in business class, later I'd learn his seat was 11B, got up and made his way toward the forward lavatory. Nothing unusual. But then he stopped, turned around, and returned to his seat without entering. A few minutes later, he repeated the behavior, this time gripping his stomach and wiping sweat from his brow with a napkin. I made a mental note. Gastrointestinal distress happens in the air, especially with jet lag, anxiety, or contaminated food. But something about him seemed off. His walk wasn't just uneasy, it was slightly disoriented, like he was fighting to stay upright. I didn't act. It wasn't my place yet. As marshals, we're trained to recognize threats, not symptoms. This was an adult man, mobile, responsive, and unarmed. Flight attendants were still performing service. The seatbelt sign was off. No one else seemed alarmed. I logged the movement, kept my tone calm, and continued observing. Not 20 minutes later, things changed rapidly. It started with a burst of shouting from the forward cabin. One of the attendants sprinted toward the galley near row 30, her hands red and shaking. I stood up instinctively, not drawing attention to myself, but listening, assessing. She ducked into the service corridor and started speaking rapidly to another crew member. I caught fragments, collapsed, blood, locked up, no response. Her voice cracked. Passengers nearby began looking around, shifting in their seats. Unease was spreading, and no one knew what to make of it. I approached the crew discreetly and identified myself. Badge, credentials, standard phrase, "I need you to tell me what's going on." The senior attendant, pale and visibly trembling, explained that the passenger from 11B had suddenly gone into seizures. They'd called for medical assistance from anyone on board, and a nurse had stepped forward to help. But then, according to her, he bit the nurse. Not lashed out. Bit, hard, tore skin. That's when she backed off and called for the cabin supervisor. They locked the front galley, contacted the cockpit, and tried to manage the situation. But he got up again, fast, wild-eyed, screaming. It didn't sound like a panic attack. It sounded like a medical emergency that had taken a violent turn. I asked if he had any known medical conditions. The manifest showed nothing. She added that 3 other passengers had begun showing symptoms, dizziness, vomiting, erratic breathing. Some said it might have been something in the food. Others speculated about bad air or a contaminant in the water. Then the intercom went silent. That was the first major red flag. Flight crews are trained to keep communication open. Silence from the cockpit mid-incident isn't just unusual, it's alarming. I moved back to my seat and retrieved my carry-on, unlocking the pistol case discreetly. I didn't draw. It wasn't time for that yet. Drawing a weapon inside a sealed aircraft is a last resort. Cabin pressure, panic, and tight quarters make it dangerous. You don't escalate unless you're absolutely sure. And right then, all I had was confusion. Passengers in economy began to notice the change in tone. A few people stood up, trying to ask questions. Someone shouted that a man had fainted in the middle rows. Another claimed someone was foaming at the mouth in the lavatory. A teenage girl ran past me down the aisle, clutching her phone and sobbing. I moved up several rows, past the galley curtain, and saw the man from 11B. But it wasn't the same man. He was hunched forward, shoulders twitching, shirt torn and soaked in something dark. His face had a strange expression. Blank, mouth slack, eyes unfocused. No recognition, no panic, no pain. Just motion. Disconnected and lurching, he stumbled toward the cabin divider. That's when he lunged at another passenger, a woman in her 40s wearing a grey business coat. He fell on her like a wild animal, biting into her neck. The sound of the impact, the way she shrieked, the blood that sprayed the seat back, it stunned everyone into silence for a second. Then the screaming started. People rose from their seats in every direction. Some bolted toward the rear galley. Others climbed over armrests or pushed down the aisles. One man tried to restrain the attacker but was pulled down with him. The woman stopped moving after a few seconds, her limbs going limp. Blood spread out from her collar and dripped down to the floor in slow, uneven streams. I moved toward the attacker, trying to issue verbal commands. "Stop! Get off her!" Nothing. No response. He turned toward me, his mouth open wider now, unblinking. He didn't recognize authority. He didn't register speech. He just charged. As I reached for my weapon, a panicked passenger slammed into my back, throwing off my balance. I aimed center mass, but my wrist twisted. The round struck his head. The body dropped instantly. The noise of the shot was deafening in the cabin. Shrieks, gasps, and confusion surged. Passengers dove for cover. Some assumed I was the threat. Others yelled for help, crying, covering their ears. I held my badge high, shouted, "Federal Marshal, stay down, let me secure the area." But no one was listening. The fear had taken over. It was every man for himself. Another person stumbled out of the lavatory and collapsed into the aisle, convulsing violently. His limbs jerked in unnatural directions, and then, without warning, he stilled. Moments later, like some horrible delayed reflex, he rose again. Same slack jaw, same dead gaze. He wasn't breathing normally. There was no recognition in his face, only motion. It didn't make sense. I'd seen people die before. I'd seen seizures. But this wasn't any drug reaction I'd encountered, and it wasn't consistent with standard biocontaminants. The incubation was too fast, the symptoms too extreme. Whatever this was, it didn't follow any known model. I began to wonder, was this a targeted biological attack? Something aerosolized? Could it have been introduced in the food or cabin airflow? Passengers were turning on one another. A man shouted that the air was poisoned. A woman screamed for someone to open the emergency door. A teenager tried to climb into the overhead bin to hide. I made my way back to the rear of the aircraft, using the beverage carts to partially block the aisle behind me. I called for calm again, but my voice was drowned out by the sheer volume of panic. At least 5 individuals were now showing signs of collapse, followed by sudden aggressive behavior. They weren't coordinated. They weren't tactical, but they moved with unrelenting force, biting, scratching, ignoring pain. I saw a man slam his shoulder into a seat until the frame broke, just to reach someone hiding under the tray table. No rational behavior, no regard for injury. And every time one of them attacked, within minutes, the victim followed the same pattern. Collapse, seizure, stillness, then motion. There wasn't time to think anymore. The moment the fifth victim rose from the floor with that same stiff, erratic motion, I stopped believing this was a coincidence or isolated trauma. I'd seen things go wrong on flights before. A stroke, a psychotic break, a heart attack in turbulence. But I had never witnessed multiple passengers collapsing and then returning to their feet within minutes, all moving with the same vacant hostility. It wasn't a virus I recognized. It wasn't any known narcotic effect either. This wasn't a synthetic hallucinogen or airborne fentanyl situation. If it was a gas or biotoxin, it didn't follow any protocol I'd trained for. And the way they were going after people, mouths open, biting like animals, it didn't feel like desperation. It felt like instinct. The rear galley was in chaos. Passengers had begun barricading themselves behind beverage carts, pushing luggage into the aisles to block access. Some people were praying. Others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. A middle-aged man tried to smash a window with his shoe, shouting something about breaking it open to let the contaminated air out. It didn't work, of course. Triple-pane composite glass in a pressurized cabin isn't something a leather loafer will get through. Still, he kept trying, drawing more panic. His wife eventually dragged him down to the floor and held him there, whispering for him to stop. I took a knee in the galley corner and tried to hail the cockpit using the wall intercom, the old handset mounted near the crew jump seat. Nothing, no dial tone, not even a static hum. The PA system was completely dead. Either they'd cut all communications intentionally, or the system had shorted. I flipped open the jump seat access panel and checked the breakers. No signs of tampering or burnouts. That was when the reality hit me. I had no idea if the cockpit crew was alive. And if they weren't, that meant no one was flying the aircraft anymore. The Boeing 777 can autopilot for hours, but it can't land itself under these conditions, especially not if the transponder is off or navigation is compromised. I needed to get forward, but between me and the flight deck were 4 cabin sections, a mass of panicking passengers, and at least a half-dozen individuals who now seemed fully hostile and no longer responsive to pain or reasoning. I didn't even know if touching them would expose me. No one knew what this was, or how it spread. Was it contact-based? Airborne? In the food? I hadn't eaten anything other than the sandwich I brought on board, and I felt fine. But that wasn't reassurance. It was just delay. The infected were scattered through the cabin now. Some were wedged between rows, hunched low, snapping their jaws at ankles and hands that got too close. Others stood in the aisles, lurching slowly toward any movement. They didn't sprint. They didn't coordinate, but they didn't stop either. When one fell, another would simply step over the body and keep moving. A woman with a deep wound across her cheek walked straight into a tray cart, staggered back, then tried again. She wasn't deterred. She didn't flinch. It was like she didn't even feel it. I moved to the service panel and triggered the emergency lights, hoping it might disorient the aggressors or signal the cockpit. The cabin lights dimmed, switching to red strips along the aisle floor and white overheads near the exits. No announcement followed. I waited 10 seconds, then 20. Nothing. I slid the panel shut and pulled my badge again, raising my voice above the crying and shouting behind me. "Federal Air Marshal," I said firmly. "I need 2 able-bodied people to help me secure a path to the front. Do not engage the attackers. Just move debris and assist anyone down. No direct contact. We don't know what we're dealing with." A few people looked up, but most kept their heads down. One man, early 30s, shaved head, wearing a Boston College sweatshirt, nodded and stepped forward. Another, a younger woman in athletic gear, with a calm expression, joined without a word. I handed the man a fire extinguisher from the galley rack and gave the woman a catering tray to use as a shield. We moved cautiously into the aisle. The middle cabin was in ruins. Luggage had been spilled everywhere, seat cushions torn, food trays scattered across the floor. There were at least 3 bodies lying motionless in the aisle. The man in front of me pushed a carry-on out of the way and looked back. "They're not breathing," he said, voice tight. "Should we check for a pulse?" "Negative," I replied. "Do not touch them unless they're moving. Eyes open, stay low." We passed row 38 just as something shifted beside us. A girl, no older than 16, jerked upward from where she'd been slumped against the seat. Her pupils were dilated, mouth open, lips crusted with dried blood. She grabbed at the tray table and tried to stand, groaning low. The man with the extinguisher hesitated. I stepped in and pressed him back. "Keep moving," I ordered. "We can't help her. Not like this." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. We moved forward. The woman used her tray to push a fallen beverage cart out of the aisle, clearing the path. Just ahead, another infected man turned, lunged at the motion, and collided with a seat divider. His hands flailed, grasping for something, anything. I raised the weapon, hesitated, then fired. The round struck his shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall. No reaction, no sound. He came again. I adjusted, aimed for the torso, fired twice more. Still nothing. He reached out, grasped the edge of my jacket, and just as I tried to pull free, someone shoved me from behind, hard. My grip shifted. The next shot went high, unintentional. It hit him square in the head. He dropped immediately, face first. For a second, no one moved. The girl with the tray looked at me. "That one didn't get back up," she said quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't have one. I hadn't aimed for that result, and I wasn't ready to draw conclusions based on one body drop. We pressed on, past the next galley divider, where the curtain to business class was half torn down. More blood here, smears along the cabin walls. 2 more bodies face down in the aisle. One of them, a tall man in a grey blazer, began to twitch as we passed. His head jerked upward and his jaw opened wide, teeth red and broken. I motioned the others back. He tried to rise, pushing himself up with one arm. The other hung limp, clearly dislocated or broken. I fired once into his torso. No response. I fired again, aiming center chest. Still nothing. The woman beside me leaned in and raised her tray. I stopped her before she got close. I took a deep breath, aimed just above the bridge of his nose, and pulled the trigger. He collapsed like a dropped coat. That's when I began to suspect we weren't dealing with toxins or psychosis. We moved into the forward galley. The smell was worse there, metallic, sour, layered with something like bile. A trail of blood led to the cockpit door. The safety curtain was torn down entirely. Emergency oxygen masks tangled in the debris. I pounded on the reinforced door. "This is Air Marshal Delano," I called. "If you're in there, I need confirmation. Use the mic. Knock once for yes, twice for no. Do not open unless you're secure." No answer. No knock. I stepped back, surveyed the damage. The manual override code panel was still intact, but attempting to access it would lock out the door for good if I failed. The crew had locked themselves in tight. Whether that meant they were alive or already gone, I couldn't say. Behind us, the screams began again. Louder this time, closer. I turned and saw more movement coming up the aisle. The girl with the tray was pulling someone to their feet. The man with the extinguisher was standing near a seat, visibly shaken, holding it out like a club. We were out of time. For a few seconds, I just stood there outside the cockpit, listening. The galley lights were flickering overhead, casting shadows that danced across the torn curtain and streaks of blood along the walls. My hand rested on the bulkhead for balance. I was trying to steady myself, but my head was already spinning through worst-case scenarios. The reinforced door in front of me had no outward signs of tampering. The manual keypad lock still glowed faintly, awaiting input. The red locked indicator was lit. That was something at least. If the flight crew was compromised, the door would either be open, broken, or in full lockdown mode from the inside. I raised my knuckles again and knocked. Once, clearly. Then I said the words slow and measured. "This is Air Marshal Delano. I'm armed and trying to assess the situation. If you can hear me, respond. Knock once for yes, twice for no." There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to make you doubt yourself. And then, I heard it. A faint knock. Just once. I exhaled slowly, but I wasn't about to relax. A single knock meant someone was still alive inside, but that didn't mean they were stable, or alone. I lowered my voice and leaned closer. "How many people are in the cockpit?" I asked. "Are both pilots functional?" The knock that followed was slower, muffled. Then came a sound that was harder to place, like someone dragging themselves forward, a rustle of cloth and a low, wet inhale. After a moment, a voice crackled through the interior intercom, barely audible, hoarse, but definitely human. "Captains, down," it said. I locked him in the lav. He turned. "I'm hit. Bleeding bad. Autopilot still on." I recognized the voice. First Officer James Murdoch was 33, a former Air Force pilot with a clean record and certification on the Boeing 777. I'd seen his name on the manifest. He didn't sound like he had long. I had to get inside, but I couldn't use the emergency override unless the crew disengaged the lock from the inside. And based on his voice, Murdoch might not even be conscious much longer. If he passed out without unlocking the door, the override would require ground authorization I didn't have access to mid-flight. We'd be sealed out until fuel exhaustion. "Listen carefully," I said. "I'm going to need access. I need to confirm your condition, assess the systems, and get comms back up. If you're able, slide the lock open. I'll enter alone. Is the cockpit safe from contamination?" A short delay. Then, "Affirmative. Cabin press intact. Just hurry." I waited, heart pounding in silence, until I heard the internal bolt retract with a solid mechanical clunk. I drew my sidearm again, safety off, and placed my left palm on the door handle. I counted down from 3 under my breath and entered quickly, sweeping the interior with a trained eye. The smell hit first: sweat, iron, and something almost chemical. Murdoch was slumped in the co-pilot seat, face grey, uniform shirt soaked through at the right side, where a makeshift bandage had been pressed beneath his vest. His breathing was shallow. He turned his head slightly when I entered, blinking slowly. A thin line of dried blood had crusted at the edge of his lips. The captain's seat was empty. "The captain?" I asked. "In there," he whispered, nodding toward the cockpit lavatory. "Locked him in after he bit me. He went stiff, eyes rolled back. Then he came at me with his teeth." I moved quickly to secure the cockpit. I locked the main door behind me, checked the window panels, and confirmed the autopilot was still engaged. The aircraft was on track, cruising at 36,000 feet, holding steady. Navigation was functioning. Fuel levels were sufficient. But the cabin intercom had been disconnected from the cockpit interface, cut at the wire. Whether the captain had done it before turning, or Murdoch had done it in panic, I couldn't say. But we had no ability to broadcast to the cabin. I opened the emergency handset and attempted to hail air traffic control. Nothing. We were beyond the effective range for continuous contact. That left the sat link. I checked the system panel, partially responsive, intermittent signal loss. The SATCOM terminal had been knocked out of sync, likely from damage during the earlier chaos. I couldn't re-establish contact with ground control yet. For now, we were completely alone up here. Murdoch's hands trembled as he pointed toward the flight manual. "I can still help," he said, but his voice was slurred. "Just let me fly. Don't let us crash." "You're bleeding out," I said. "You need medical attention." He shook his head. "No time. Focus on the cabin. They don't know. They don't understand." I looked at him for a long moment. He was right. The situation behind that door was beyond anything I'd ever trained for, and the passengers had no structure or leadership. If this continued unchecked, they'd rip each other apart before we ever saw land again. I had to buy time and restore order, but first, I needed help. I exited the cockpit, locking it behind me, and made my way back down the aisle. More passengers had moved into the rear sections, congregating in huddled clusters. Many were injured. Others just sat wide-eyed, staring at nothing, their faces pale from shock and dehydration. I caught the eye of a flight attendant crouched near the galley. Her uniform was torn, one arm bandaged with masking tape. She looked up as I approached, startled. "Name?" I asked. "Jasmine," she said. "Senior attendant." "I need your help, Jasmine. We've got one pilot still breathing, but he's not going to last much longer. We're cut off from the ground and don't have full communication with the cabin. I need someone who knows this aircraft, who knows these passengers." She nodded, lips pressed tight, no argument, just action. "Start organizing people," I told her. "Get them to pile every bag, suitcase, and carry on into the center aisle. Stack it, waist height, as much as you can. Block off sections of the cabin like fire breaks. If those things try to cross, they'll have to slow down. She hesitated. You want us to barricade the infected in? No, I said. We can't contain them. Not yet. But we can slow them down. Buy time. Separate the healthy from anyone showing symptoms. Anyone passed out, bleeding, or acting erratically. Move them to the aft lavatories and block the doors. We'll deal with it section by section. Jasmine stood and clapped her hands, shouting instructions to nearby passengers. Her voice cut through the noise like a drill sergeant's. People moved, not all at once, and not perfectly, but they moved. Suitcases were dragged into the aisle, roller bags were flipped sideways. Someone passed out bungee cords from a crew drawer, and we used them to bind the stacks together like makeshift barricades. It wasn't elegant, but it was better than open pathways. 2 children helped stack blankets across the top to make the barriers taller. An elderly woman volunteered gauze and antiseptic from her purse. A man who claimed to be a dentist started checking unconscious passengers for signs of breath. No one had answers, but they were trying. Panic hadn't vanished, but for the first time, it wasn't eating us alive. One infected woman, barefoot, bloodied, and hunched like a predator, tried to cross from economy into the main galley, but she tripped over the baggage wall and was struck repeatedly with a fire extinguisher by the man I'd recruited earlier. His hands shook. She didn't get back up. For the next hour, we worked. The aisles were transformed into a patchwork of improvised roadblocks. I positioned myself near the central galley with my back to the wall, sidearm lowered but ready. I knew the pattern now, even if I didn't understand the cause. Victims collapsed, sometimes violently. A short period of stillness followed. Then came the twitching, then the groaning, then movement. Always the same cycle, always escalating. I still didn't know what triggered it. Bite wounds were the common factor, but one man with no visible trauma had turned after vomiting violently. A woman who had only been scratched was showing signs of fever and confusion. If this was a pathogen, it was evolving rapidly, or we were simply too late in identifying its origin. At one point, Jasmine returned with an older man she'd found hiding behind the service cart. Medical? I asked. Retired ER, he said, holding up trembling hands. Name's Harold. I can help triage, but I need gloves. I need ethanol. We gave him what we could. Crew gloves, galley cleaning supplies, plastic utensils for tongue depressors. He began checking passengers for signs of dehydration, delirium, trauma. I posted one of the stronger volunteers with him for protection. The infected didn't speak. They didn't cry. They just kept coming, every time a gap opened in our defenses. We pushed them back, regrouped, reset. Each time we lost another space. But we were learning, adapting. And I kept glancing at the cockpit door, wondering how much longer our pilot had before we'd need to make a very different plan. The barricades were mostly in place. Not perfect, but effective enough for now. Most of the passengers had settled into a strange mix of quiet cooperation and silent dread. The ones who could help were busy, handing out water, tightening straps, checking for symptoms. The ones who couldn't were either curled into themselves in window seats or staring blankly at nothing. The mood in the rear galley was grim but not chaotic. That was something. You learn over time that containment isn't always about force. It's about direction. People want to help when they believe there's a plan, and for now, I was the only one giving directions. But I couldn't do much else until I knew where we were going, or if we were even going to make it. The first officer was still conscious last I checked, but barely. If he blacked out or the situation in the cockpit worsened, there'd be no recovery. The Boeing can stay on autopilot for a long stretch, but not indefinitely, and certainly not through descent. We needed ground support. We needed a runway. And more importantly, we needed a place prepared for what we were bringing with us. I made my way back to the front of the plane, stepping carefully over the luggage piles and helping an older woman sit back down after she'd slipped crossing one of the baggage barriers. Her hands were trembling, but she nodded when I steadied her. I gave her a blanket, said nothing, and kept moving. The cockpit door was still locked. I knocked once, loud enough to be heard over the engine hum. A beat later, the deadbolt clicked open. The door cracked and Murdoch's bloodshot eyes met mine. He didn't speak, just nodded once, slow and deliberate. I stepped inside and sealed it behind me. Murdoch looked worse. His shirt was soaked through, lips dry and cracked. One of his hands had lost color entirely. His uniform collar was stained with dried sweat and something darker, but he was upright, belt still fastened to the seat, hands lightly resting on the yoke. The cabin lighting cast a pale blue glow over everything, making the blood on his neck seem black instead of red. "Still with me?" I asked. "Barely," he whispered, "but I've got a sat-link patch, up to ATC. Windows closing. You need to talk fast." He flipped a switch and pulled down the secondary comm handset, pressing it into my hand. The small display on the panel blinked, NORAD liaison, UHF secure, then jumped to standby acknowledge. I adjusted the headset and keyed the mic. "This is American 223, requesting emergency diversion and immediate landing clearance," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Be advised we have multiple medical casualties on board. Unknown infection vector, spreading rapidly. One pilot incapacitated. This is an in-flight emergency. We need a secure runway. Medical and security response at the ready. No civilians." There was a moment of static. Then a clipped voice responded, calm and professional. "American 223, this is Joint Emergency Control. We copy your declaration. Confirm nature of onboard incident. Biological, chemical, or unknown." "Unknown," I said. "Symptoms include violent behavior, seizures, rapid onset, possible contamination through direct contact. Repeat, unknown pathogen. Non-coherent passengers becoming physically aggressive. Crew compromised. I repeat, captain is down." The voice didn't falter. "Roger that. Diverting to alternate field. You are rerouted to Fort Drum, Wheeler-Sac Army Airfield, Watertown, New York. Coordinates transmitting now. Medical isolation and perimeter security are en route. Estimated runway access in 71 minutes. Maintain current altitude and heading. Do not attempt descent until confirmed. Acknowledge." "Acknowledged," I said, glancing at Murdoch. He gave me a tight nod, eyes barely staying open. I keyed again. "We'll hold altitude and await final instructions. If we lose communication, assume partial crew incapacitation. Repeat, assume compromised command structure." "Copy that 223, the voice said. "You are now classified as restricted biohazard priority. Keep your cockpit sealed. Report any onboard changes immediately." The line went silent. Murdoch let out a long, shaky exhale and sagged in his chair. "You did good," I told him. "We're rerouted. Military field. They'll be waiting for us." He tried to nod, but couldn't quite manage it. His eyes fluttered shut for a second before snapping open again. I can't land this thing," he murmured. "Not like this. You'll need someone to talk you through it. If I black out, you call them. Don't wait." "I'm not leaving the cockpit unmanned," I said. "Then stay," he whispered, "but don't trust the dead." I didn't ask what he meant. He slumped slightly, head sagging to the side. I watched him for a moment, then leaned across and checked the controls. Altitude steady. Heading matched what the dispatcher fed us. Fort Drum was still a long way off, but if the aircraft held together and Murdoch held on, we could make it. But I had my doubts about both. I left the cockpit briefly, rejoining Jasmine and the passengers in the center cabin. She was organizing a system for tagging potentially exposed individuals. Duct tape around one wrist. Not elegant, but visual. It allowed others to keep their distance. We'd already quarantined 6 people in the aft lavatories. 2 of them weren't moving anymore. No one was eager to check if they were still breathing. I gave her the update. Diverting to Fort Drum, ETA 70 minutes. Secure perimeter waiting. She didn't blink, just nodded once and turned to update the others. I moved back toward the cockpit, scanning every row as I passed. The infected were quiet for now, blocked behind a double barricade of suitcases and broken tray carts. But they weren't still. I saw one press his face between the bags, mouth opening and closing rhythmically like he was tasting the air. When I re-entered the flight deck, Murdoch was still slouched in his seat, mouth slightly open, shallow breaths rasping through dry lips. I checked his pulse at the neck, weak but present. He stirred at the touch, then looked up at me, unfocused. "You okay?" I asked. "Hurts," he murmured. "Feel cold, inside." I grabbed one of the emergency blankets from behind the seat and tucked it around him, more out of principle than effectiveness. His skin felt clammy, his pupils sluggish. He was fading. I considered calling the dispatcher again, asking for a patch-in to a pilot with simulator experience who could walk me through descent and manual override. But I still had time. As long as Murdoch was breathing, I wasn't flying solo. Then he convulsed. It started with a jolt, a sudden, violent twitch that rocked his whole frame. His hand struck the side panel, flipping 2 switches and darkening one of the displays. I reached across to correct it when his head snapped back and his eyes rolled upward. His body went rigid. A horrible choking sound escaped his throat. Foam bubbled at the edges of his mouth. His legs kicked once, then stilled. I stood frozen, watching. I didn't know if it was cardiac arrest, seizure, or final shock. I'd seen death before, but something about the posture, how stiff he was, how unnatural the tension in his arms was, didn't read right. I grabbed the headset and keyed into the internal PA. "Jasmine," I said, "get up here now. Bring a medical kit, quietly." 30 seconds later, the cockpit door opened. She stepped in, crouched beside Murdoch, and checked his airway. She touched his neck, paused, and then shook her head. "Pulse is gone." "I know," I said, "but I don't think we're done." She looked up confused, then his hand shot out. It caught her across the wrist hard. She screamed, stumbled backward, and hit the bulkhead. I moved fast, grabbing Murdoch's collar and pulling him back. His mouth snapped open wide, teeth bared, eyes glassy. His whole body moved like it was attached to a system that had skipped all safety checks. I slammed him against the side console and held him there. His arms flailed. Jasmine scrambled behind me, clutching her wrist, staring in disbelief. "Get out," I shouted. "Lock the door behind you." She hesitated. Then she ran. I pinned Murdoch's shoulders against the panel, trying to keep his thrashing under control. But he was strong, unnaturally strong. His head snapped forward and nearly caught my shoulder. His breath was foul, like old blood and chemical burn. I drew my sidearm and held it against his temple. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. Then I pulled the trigger. The shot rang through the cockpit like a hammer on steel. Murdoch slumped in his seat, the back of his head resting against the shattered display behind him. Blood soaked into the headrest fabric. The motion stopped instantly. 1 second earlier, he had been thrashing with the intensity of someone possessed. The next, he was just dead weight. This time for good. I lowered the pistol and exhaled, jaw clenched hard. My ears were ringing from the confined blast, but I didn't leave. Not yet. I checked the flight systems. Autopilot still engaged. Altitude holding. Heading still on course for Fort Drum. But the longer I stared at those glowing instruments, the more it felt like they were mocking me. I knew how to operate radios. I could identify basic indicators. But flying manually? That was a skill set far outside my training. The headset buzzed softly with the dispatcher's voice. "American 223, please confirm pilot status." I picked up the handset and forced my tone to stay even. "This is Air Marshal Delano. First officer is now deceased. No remaining certified flight crew on board. Aircraft is stable for now. Requesting immediate coordination for substitute landing assistance or remote vectoring." The response came back quickly. "Acknowledged, Delano. We are scanning for commercial pilots in your region, but at present, there are no active personnel aboard Flight 223 logged with current certifications. Recommend identifying any personnel with flight experience, regardless of category or hours. We can assist with systems from ground, but landing protocol must be manually executed. Repeat, manual landing will require onboard hands. Manual landing, in a wide-body commercial jet, with no one certified in the cockpit." I locked the cockpit behind me again and re-entered the cabin. Jasmine was leaning against the wall, holding an ice pack to her bruised wrist. She looked up as I approached. Her expression said it all. I didn't need to explain what had happened. She already knew. "Barricades are holding for now," she said, voice low and hoarse. "But we've had a breach attempt near row 40. One of them climbed onto the backs of the seats, almost got over the luggage wall before someone hit him with a cane. They're figuring things out. That line stopped me. Figuring things out. It had always been about instinct before. Biting, grabbing, pushing. But if they were beginning to navigate obstacles deliberately, that changed the equation. They didn't have to be smart. They just had to be persistent enough to adapt. "I need to talk to everyone," I said. "Now." She nodded and picked up the portable PA unit we'd managed to reactivate from a secondary panel. The intercom hissed as I keyed the mic. "This is Federal Air Marshal Delano. I need your attention," I said, projecting into the handset. "We have rerouted to a secure military airfield in upstate New York. Emergency services will be waiting. However, both flight crew are now deceased. This aircraft cannot land itself. I am asking if there is anyone on board with any flight experience, civilian, military, commercial, private. Please step forward. We are running out of time." The line went quiet. I handed the mic back to Jasmine and scanned the rows. Dozens of faces stared up at me, some wide-eyed, others numb. A few people exchanged glances, but no one moved. Then, from row 29, a hand went up slowly. The man who stood was thin and grey-haired, maybe late 60s, wearing a worn flannel jacket and jeans. His posture had the slow deliberateness of someone who worked with his hands. He walked up the aisle with quiet purpose, pausing at the galley divider. "I flew," he said, meeting my eyes. "Crop dusters. Back in the late 80s through early 2000s. Piper Pawnee. Mostly over corn and soy fields near Burlington. I was certified for ag work. Haven't touched a stick in years. It wasn't what I hoped for, but it was something." I stepped closer. "What's your name?" "Carl Jensen. I was a mechanic before that. Worked on diesel pumps. Still do, actually, if the farm needs me. My son runs it now." I nodded. "Carl, this bird isn't a crop duster. It's triple engine redundancy, digital avionics, and a fly-by-wire control system. There's no throttle stick. The control columns are connected to multiple flight computers, but I don't have anyone else. Would you be willing to try if I talked you through it with ground assistance?" Carl took a long breath, looking down the aisle toward the cockpit door. "You're saying no one else is available?" "Not unless one of the unconscious passengers wakes up with 30 years of 747 experience," I said. He scratched his jaw, then looked around the cabin. "I know spray planes, low altitude, slow turns. Nothing above 300 feet most days. I can't promise I'll get us down, but I've landed dead stick after an engine fire once. That was in '94. If I can help, I'll try." I stepped aside. "Come with me." As we moved forward, Jasmine grabbed my sleeve. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "No," I said, "but I'm sure we don't have another choice." We reached the cockpit. I opened the door and let Carl step inside first. He paused just inside the threshold, staring at the instruments. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "This thing's more screens than gauges. No yoke either. What are these, side sticks?" "Correct. Airbus-style configuration. But it's Boeing. Inputs are redundant across both seats. That one's dead. You'll take the right." Carl lowered himself into the seat carefully, as if it might reject him. His hands hovered above the controls without touching. "Can I ask what happened to the pilot?" "You don't want to know," I said. I keyed the comm panel and signaled the dispatcher. "This is American 223. We have a civilian with previous flight experience now seated at the controls. Name is Carl Jensen, former agricultural pilot. Limited instrument familiarity. Request immediate walkthrough of final descent checklist and approach pattern for Fort Drum." "Copy 223, the dispatcher responded. "We are updating the system now. Your estimated approach vector is aligned for runway 32R. Landing strip length is 11,000 feet. Weather is clear. Tower is standing by. We will begin descent prep in 20 minutes. Please advise when substitute pilot is ready for flight system briefing." Carl glanced at me. "I'm not sure what all these abbreviations mean. I haven't used an ILS or VOR in decades. Just a compass and my gut." "You're not flying solo," I said. "I'll be here, and dispatch will walk you through every control input. You're just hands on the stick." He gave a small nod. "Then I'm in." I moved Murdoch's body gently out of the way and covered him with the second emergency blanket, securing him into the back corner of the cockpit. Then I sat in the left seat and began scanning the instrument panels again. 1 hour to landing. The cockpit was manned. The infected were growing more aggressive. And no matter how many bags we stacked, the truth was starting to settle in. We were flying inside a coffin with wings. The cabin had grown too quiet. That eerie, anticipatory kind of quiet. Not calm, not safe, just the absence of immediate screaming. A dangerous illusion. The kind of silence where people convince themselves that everything bad has already happened. I didn't buy it. There were still infected behind the barricades. Still people with duct tape markers on their wrists slumped in window seats. Not yet moving, but not fully gone either. And worst of all, there was something we'd forgotten. It hit me as I turned back toward the cockpit door to speak with Jasmine again. The rear lavatories were sealed. The mid-cabin barricades were intact. We'd handled Murdoch, but we never accounted for the captain, the one Murdoch said he locked in the cockpit lavatory. We never checked, never opened the door, never secured it. We'd left him in there, like an unexploded bomb. I spun on my heel, rushing past the avionics panel and toward the rear wall of the flight deck. The lavatory door there was a slim, reinforced panel just behind the jump seat. Nothing unusual at first glance, but the surface was bent outward slightly in the middle, a slight bulge. I froze, then something inside hit it. Once, hard, then again, the latch rattled violently. "Get back!" I barked at Jasmine, who had been standing just feet away, watching Carl adjust his seat. She moved instinctively, dropping to the floor behind me. The door cracked with a metallic creak, and then the upper hinge gave out. The figure that burst out was unrecognizable as a uniformed officer. The captain, at least what used to be him, lunged forward with a distorted gait, arms swinging low, mouth wide open. His left eye was gone, his neck mottled with livid bruising. There was no hesitation in him, no warning snarl, just raw, unstoppable momentum. I fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The first 2 hit center mass, staggering him back. The third clipped his temple and dropped him to the floor. He didn't get back up. Jasmine was staring at the body, wide-eyed, her breath shallow. She hadn't been bitten, but he'd gotten close. Too close. And in a situation where uncertainty was our biggest liability, I couldn't take chances. "Sit," I told her, pointing to the observer jump seat just behind the first officer's position. "Now." She hesitated, confused, until she saw me pulling a length of nylon cable from the emergency kit. Her expression turned from panic to betrayal. "Mark, don't do this. I'm not infected." "I believe you," I said, "but they won't, and I can't afford an outbreak in this cockpit right now. It's not punishment, it's precaution." She didn't resist as I bound her wrists loosely in front and secured the cable to the seat's lap belt attachment. It wasn't tight. She could shift, breathe, move her hands, but she wouldn't be able to leap across the cockpit if something changed. I placed a water bottle in reach and met her eyes. "You're not a threat," I told her. "This is just for 10 minutes, that's all we need." She gave a slow nod. Her jaw was tight, but she understood. Survival makes strangers of everyone, even allies. Before returning to the cockpit, I moved through the cabin one last time. I assigned 3 passengers, alert, steady, to watch the aisles and report any movement, sudden illness, or breach attempts. I told everyone else to brace. If they could hold on to something, do it. Keep their heads down. We couldn't afford chaos during descent. I made them repeat back the instructions. Then I locked the cockpit and strapped in. I returned to my seat beside Carl, who was watching the whole thing without comment. He was focused on the flight displays now, hands hovering above the side stick as if it might bite him. The headset crackled. "American 223, this is Fort Drum approach. We are on final coordination now. Begin descent to flight level 1000. Reduce speed to 220 knots. Landing vector will be adjusted 3 degrees west to compensate for wind. Do you copy?" Carl cleared his throat and leaned toward the mic. "Fort Drum, this is substitute pilot Carl Jensen, crop duster veteran, but I'll try not to kill us. Copy descent to 11,000, reducing speed now." Affirmative 223, the controller said. Tower is visual. Expect rough guidance. You are our first aircraft in a biological containment scenario. We will deploy medical on touchdown. Carl nodded to himself, mumbling quietly. All right, girl. Let's see if you float like the old Pawnee. I stayed focused on the instruments, helping him interpret the digital overlays. Altitude decreasing, heading steady. The clouds began to thin out ahead of us, revealing distant lights on the ground. Fort Drum's emergency perimeter. The runway loomed in the dark like a thin grey ribbon, flanked by searchlights and blinking hazard markers. We came in low, too low frankly, but Carl kept us from dipping. His grip was tight, knuckles white, sweat pouring down his face. He made no sudden moves. Every correction was gradual, deliberate, guided by the voice in his headset and muscle memory from a lifetime ago. At 1,000 feet, the aircraft began to shudder. The crosswinds off the ridge were pushing us hard. The stabilizer alarms buzzed. I muted them manually. Carl adjusted the trim using the touchpad, muttering under his breath. At 500 feet, we dropped too fast. The nose dipped sharply. I grabbed the side console and shouted, "Pull! Ease up now!" Carl pulled gently, the stick resisting before giving way. We leveled, barely. The approach lights screamed by. The main gear slammed into the tarmac with a violent bounce. One of the tires blew. The fuselage tilted left, scraping the wingtip along the ground in a burst of sparks. The nose dipped hard. We didn't skid. We plowed. The left engine tore free. The belly of the aircraft ground across the far end of the runway and onto the overshoot gravel. Everything shook. Ceiling panels came loose. Oxygen masks dropped. Emergency lights flickered. The aircraft slammed down harder than expected. The first impact had felt like hitting concrete at speed, but it was the second bounce that did the most damage. We tilted sharply left as the left landing gear collapsed and the wing dug into the tarmac. I heard metal shriek, a howl of tortured steel. The fuselage twisted, jolting passengers in their seats like ragdolls. Luggage exploded from the bins. The overhead compartments popped open, pelting people with bags and broken plastic. Some passengers screamed, others didn't. The noise was overwhelming, tearing, scraping, screaming, choking, until it wasn't. As the aircraft skidded past the runway and onto the gravel beyond, a wall panel behind row 42 broke loose and crushed 2 passengers against the seats. Someone near the rear section was ejected into the overhead rack. I remember a sharp metallic taste in my mouth, blood maybe, or shock, and then the cockpit floor pitched hard upward. I slammed into the console, shoulder first, then hit the ground with my head turned sideways. Everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I couldn't tell where I was. My vision blurred at the edges. A rhythmic beeping echoed in the background. I tried to move, but something tugged at my right wrist. It was cold, restrictive, a cuff. Metal, not plastic. I blinked against the low fluorescent light overhead. The air smelled like iodine and canvas. The ceiling above me wasn't a ceiling at all. It was green tarp stretched over an aluminum frame. Somewhere nearby, a generator hummed. A mobile field tent, a military medical unit. Pain started creeping back in, first as dull throbs in my ribs, then as a sharp pressure behind my left ear. My mouth was dry, my throat raw. I could barely raise my head when a scream pierced the air from the far side of the tent. It wasn't distant. It was close, just beyond the partition. A voice shouting in panic, a cry for help. Then came the chaos. I heard a metallic crash, a bed tipping over, and a medic shouting, "Get back, don't let him bite you." Another scream, brief, cut off by a burst of gunfire. 3 sharp reports from what sounded like an M4. The sound rolled across the tent like thunder. The screaming stopped. I saw shadows moving beyond the divider. Boots, a stretcher, someone yelling for containment. I turned my head just enough to see a uniformed soldier pass by with a rifle raised, face grim, eyes locked ahead. The curtain near my cot pulled back. Another soldier entered, taller, heavy frame, tan fatigues. He didn't speak. He just looked me over, noted the handcuff, and called over his shoulder, "He's awake." Minutes passed, maybe more. A different man entered next. Early 40s, square jaw, commander's posture. His name tag read Riley. He didn't introduce himself until he sat down beside the cot, flanked by 2 more MPs with sidearms drawn. "Captain Dan Riley, 10th Mountain Division," he said. "We recovered 36 survivors from Flight 223, 12 critical, 14 unresponsive, 9 presumed infected. We also recovered 3 firearms. 1 was yours." I nodded once. "Correct. Air Marshal Mark Delano. Badge is in my coat pocket." He didn't move to retrieve it. "You're being placed under military supervision until full decontamination protocols are complete, for your safety and for ours. You were found unconscious next to the body of your pilot. There were injuries on both of you. You were armed, so you can understand the scrutiny." "I put him down," I said, voice hoarse. He turned, same as the others. Riley stared at me for a moment, then pulled out a small notebook. "You were the only remaining authority figure on board when the aircraft landed. We've reviewed the transponder logs, audio transmissions, and distress signals. I've got a partial record of your comms with Fort Drum approach. You requested a secure landing for a biohazard threat, with multiple casualties. How long had the situation been unfolding?" I gave him everything. Timeline, symptoms, Murdoch's collapse, the old man in the cockpit, the barricades, even the passengers who tried to help. I left nothing out. Riley didn't interrupt. He didn't take his eyes off mine once. Only after I stopped talking did he nod to one of the MPs, who stepped forward and uncuffed me without a word. "You're being moved to Quarantine Zone 2, Riley said. "Temporary shelter for uninfected survivors. You'll be under observation for 72 hours. If your blood work comes back clean and you don't exhibit signs, we'll debrief you further." "Who else made it?" I asked. He stood up. "We'll let you know." 2 soldiers escorted me across the gravel perimeter to a separate tent lined with chain-link fencing. A generator buzzed near the rear. Inside were 6 more people in hospital gowns, all seated on cots, staring into space. One of them, Jasmine, looked up and gave me the smallest nod. I sat down near the edge of the tent, staring at the heavy canvas wall that blocked our view of the outside. There were no windows, no clocks, just the dull pulse of filtered light and the faint groan of people too tired to cry anymore. I don't know why I survived. Maybe because I was trained to observe. Maybe because I kept moving. Maybe because I didn't get bit, or scratched, or breathed in the wrong air at the wrong moment. But that's just guessing. The truth is simpler and colder. I survived because someone had to land the plane. Because someone had to be the last one still trying when everyone else had either given up, gone mad, or turned into something else entirely. And now I wait. For symptoms. For answers. For the next scream outside the tent. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.